I'm so glad that you could join me tonight for my inaugural video on what is hopefully a long series of soft-spoken nature talks. Since this is my first post, I wanted to give a brief introduction before I start this video for tonight. I am an ecologist based in Canada, and I have a deep love for both nature, animals, plants, and most importantly, ASMR. If those topics are of interest to you, then I certainly hope you join me for tonight and subscribe for more videos on nature-related ASMR content. Now, the goal of this channel is to talk to you about a variety of different topics, some zoology, some botany, taxonomy, ecology, and really give some educational background on topics that I am passionate about in a soft-spoken and relaxing manner. So I sincerely hope you join me tonight for our first post, which is Michigan trees. Michigan trees. So this book is one of my absolute favorite field guides of all time, and there are several reasons for that. First and foremost, it was recommended to me for my very first field job ever. So one of my first jobs in university was working as a field technician in Ontario, doing surveys for plants and animals. And one of the most important things that we had to identify plants correctly was this book right here. During a lot of our field surveys, we would need to identify species in various age categories as well as environments. So this book, Michigan Trees, encompasses the general Great Lakes location and all the common tree species that exist within that area. So, there are a couple different things that I want to talk about. But first and foremost, before we begin our talk about trees, I want to first explain what a tree even is, because so many people don't actually know, and it's one of my favorite topics to explain to people who aren't from the environmental sciences. So what is a tree? Well, a tree is a similar concept to a vegetable. It is a societal construct that is not based in any solid taxonomy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, trees are not a taxonomic group. They are not related to each other. And in fact, they are actually some of the most distantly related plant organisms you can find. So let's give an example for context. A common tree that we have here in Ontario is the white pine. This is a coniferous tree species, which is a member of the gymnosperms, so a very basal plant group that evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. If we look at an oak tree, this is an angiosperm, or a flowering plant. This is a very new group of plants that evolved during the Cretaceous period, meaning they're much more recent in evolutionary history. Now, what most people don't know is that an oak tree is actually more closely related to a dandelion than it is to any other conifer or pine tree. So when we talk about trees, we typically refer to any plant that has a woody stem. Wood as opposed to herbaceous plants. Herbaceous plants having a green and pliable stem that is not hard in the same way that wood is. Now, of course, there are shrubs as well, which complicates everything, because how do we determine what's a tree and what is a shrub? Now, different parts of the world will use different practices, especially considering that some tree species can also form shrubs under the right environmental conditions, or if they are under extreme environmental stress, which is something we will talk about in future videos. But typically, anything above the main understory, so depending on where you are, 15 to 20 feet with a diameter at breast height, which is a measurement we ecologists use, that is greater than 10 centimeters. So if things meet that criteria, we typically consider them to be acting in that ecosystem as a tree as opposed to a shrub, which is shorter, more bushy, and doesn't have the same thickness, although it does have a woody base. So what I hope we can do today is just talk about some of the basics of tree identification skills and parts of the tree that are used for making critical identifications. makes it such a powerful tool for field identification. So we just talked about this, the difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms. Right now, we are going to go to page 11 and 12, where we can reach our first topic for tonight. And this is about different types of leaves. Now, when you think of leaves on a single tree, you typically conjure an image of something charismatic, like a maple tree, something that most people can recognize, especially if you're from North America. But what many people are unaware of is that leaves within the same exact tree species can vary significantly. Take, for instance, the white oak, which is a very extreme example of a shade versus a sun leaf. So what happens is, at the tops of crowns in mature white oak trees that are nice and tall and exposed to ample sunlight, we have these large lobes around the outside of the leaves. These large lobes and sinuses are characteristic of a leaf near the top of the tree that is getting significant sunlight. As we go further down the same tree, or in a smaller tree, such as a sapling that is trying to break through the understory, we notice that the leaves are different. The leaves are different. Now, this is part of a phenomenon known as phenotypic plasticity. The physical characteristics of trees change as they grow, as they meet different environmental conditions. Their leaves and their physiology must change to adapt. And since plants are not mobile like animals, they're what we call sessile organisms. Sessile means they stay in place. And since they don't have the option to move to an area with more sunlight, they must compensate with phenotypic plasticity. This, in turn, means that trees that are lower in the canopy and closer to the ground must have broader leaf areas to compensate for the lack of sunlight that is seen in the crown of a tree. So this very same white oak tree, at the base versus at the top, has a potential to have different shaped leaves, or a sapling white oak could have a much broader leaf to capture any bit of sunlight that pierces through to the understory. We're going to move on to another important part of leaf morphology, which is the different leaf types. Now, this is probably one of the most important things you can learn for tree identification, as it's extremely accessible, particularly in the spring when leaves have started to come in the summer and in the fall time. Later we will talk about bud and leaf scar identification, which is extremely helpful for late fall and winter identification of trees. But during the summertime, when you're likely to be doing field work, you're mostly going to be paying attention to the leaf type. So there are many different kinds of leaves. The most basic and simplest, if you will, is the simple leaf, which is just the classic leaf that you might think of, right? It's attached to the twig singly. It is not in any pairs or clusters, and it's its own neat entity that is very easy to identify. This is common in species like American beech and sugar maple, for example. Then we have pinnately compound leaves. Now, compound leaves is where it gets a little bit tricky, especially if you're new to tree identification. So what we mean when we talk about compound leaves is this entire thing is a leaf. So imagine that there is a twig or a stem running perpendicular here, right? You might think that this is the twig which the leaves are all attached to, but that's actually not the case. This whole thing is the leaf, and it is attached to a branch. So the leaf scar and bud will start right here, and this whole thing is the leaf. Now, this is common on many different species, but you'll see it in things like ash. Ash trees are pinnately compound, meaning they have these bundles of leaves with varying numbers, and the number of which in Now these are even more confusing because now we have a main stem with each of these separate leaflets that is then broken down even further. So it's like a pinnately compound leaf, but multiple times. This is common in locust trees and is something that is somewhat challenging to identify or just to see where the actual leaf starts from the bud. But once you get a hang of it, it becomes much easier. Next we have palmately compound leaves. Now, palmately compound leaves are personally my favorite type of leaf. They're just so interesting to look at, and they're called that because, well, partly because they look like the palm of a hand, right? So you imagine your hand is sort of open like this. You have the same configuration of leaves as your fingers splaying out. So some common examples of palmately compound trees, especially here in North America, would be the Ohio buckeye, and the horse chestnut. Now, the horse chestnut was introduced into North America, but the Ohio buckeye is a native member of that horse chestnut family. And next we move on to leaf arrangement. So we covered the leaf type, meaning the individual leaf and its characteristics. But now we must look at how the leaves are arranged on the twig. So probably one of the most common arrangements, at least here in North America, is the alternate arrangement. So in trees that have leaves which are alternately arranged, we see that the bud will produce one leaf, and then up a little bit further, another leaf. But they're mismatched, so they're never directly opposite from each other. They sort of go in an alternating pattern, as the name would suggest, up the side of the twig in the same direction that the buds are going. So you think of something like a basswood would be a good example of this. Now we move to opposite. So we can see this is the twig down the middle that connects these leaves to the main tree. The buds are directly on the opposite side of the twig from each other, with the leaf growing directly adjacent on the other side. So this is what we call an opposite arrangement. And this arrangement is very common in maple trees, in ashes, and in dogwood species. So it's a very useful identification characteristic for those main groups. And then lastly we have whorled. So a whorled configuration is probably the rarest, at least here in North America. Only a select handful of species have a whorled arrangement, at least where I'm from in Ontario. This essentially means that, similar to an opposite leaf, they come out at the same point on the twig, except that there's more than two, so they're not directly opposite of each other. There could be many leaves coming up from the same cluster at the same point on the twig. A common example of this would be catalpa trees, which I believe this example is of a catalpa with its large, broad leaves. Right. So next we're going to move on to different leaf shapes, as well as leaf bases and margins. So some of the most common leaf shapes you'll see are divided between, as we discussed, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So in conifers, we see a variety of different leaf types, which, again, are typically considered to be needles or explained as needles from a morphological standpoint. So we can have all-shaped leaves, which is a needle. We can have scale-like, which you might see on conifers like eastern red cedar or junipers. You can have needle-like leaves, which you're going to likely see on things like white pines or red pines. And you can have linear leaves, which you might find on things like eastern hemlock, which have much shorter needles that are kind of flat-like. And these all-shaped are more common on spruce trees. Now let's move on to some of the angiosperm leaves. So there's a variety of different terms that we use to describe the angle of the leaf itself and how the mass of the leaf is orientated. So branches out from the base, reaching sort of like a kite. It gets wider right near the tip before it comes down to a single point. With Lancelot, we have like a lance. It looks like a spearhead where the base is wider than the tip. We have this gradual slope that points to the tip. For elliptical leaves, they are quite symmetrical, being an ellipses pattern. Ovate leaves are much larger than a lanceolate leaf, but similarly have majority of the bulk at or below the midpoint of the leaf. So it is much fatter than the lanceolate, which is what we use to differentiate the two. Now, obovate leaves. These look much more like a kite and are much broader than the obolanceolate. Lance being much more skinny, and it's used as sort of an additive term to denote that, it has characteristics of being obovate, but it's skinnier. So the lanceolate comes in the second half of the word. But for obovate leaves, they are much broader, about 3/4 of the way up the leaf, coming to a loosely defined point. For spatulate leaves, we see a broadening right at the end with a rounded tip. Oval-like leaves are, as the name would suggest, an oval shape. They're similar in symmetry to an elliptical leaf shape, but just squished down vertically, so they're much plumper. You also have heart-shaped leaves, which are sometimes referred to as cordate. These are, as you can tell, they kind of look like an upside-down pear. They're quite wide at the base and form sort of an inverted heart shape, which the name would suggest. We also have orbicular leaves. Now these are almost entirely circular, so they don't have the tip at the end, and they form almost a complete perfect circle. We have oblong leaves, which branch out right at the base, have a very straight profile on the side, and then branch back in, or angle back in, right at the tip. And then last but not least, we have deltoid. Now deltoid leaves are basically a triangle, so similar to the heart-shaped, except that they don't have the curved indentation at the base. They come out straight, almost at a 90-degree angle, before coming to a triangular tip. Okay. So now that we've covered the leaf shape as a whole, we can then further reduce this based on the leaf tips themselves. So you might be thinking, wow, this is a lot of information so far, and you'd be correct. With tree identification, it can be a tedious process, and it's not always so straightforward. Trees, each individual, unlike animals, or unlike some species of animal, can be extremely different in morphology, and it really comes down to a trained eye to be able to, detect subtle differences in leaf shape, to be able to identify an oval versus ovate, and it's something that you can only build with years of experience in the field. But of course, these guides are very useful at reducing the number of species you have to filter through by using their identification keys to sort of narrow down the species list of what it could be that you're observing. So moving on to leaf tips, we have acuminate, which is the classic, comes to a point which is either straight or goes in a slight right or left direction. For an acute leaf, it's like a triangle. It comes to a well-defined centerline point. Obtuse leaf tips are fairly common. They're one of the more common leaf types, but they're very broad and they don't have a sharp angle at the tip here. Emarginate leaves have an indentation at the tip as opposed to a protrusion. And recrinate have a little tip at the end, which is something you don't see very often. So cunate, this prefers means that at the base of the stem of the leaf, if you were to fold it directly in half, is it asymmetrical? So would a piece of this leaf hang over if you were to fold it in half down the center line? And in that case, we call it inequilateral. Or is it rounded? So perfectly round again, quite symmetrical, but broad and obtuse. And then subcorticate means there is a sharper angle, but it's still much more rounded than you'd see in something like an acute leaf. And again, these are all, they can be quite difficult to distinguish in the field because two leaves might not look the same on the same tree or between individuals of the same species. So this, again, is a very useful introduction to tree identification. It can be a very powerful tool. But being good at identifying trees comes with hours of patience and experience in the field. So next we'll talk about leaf margins. Leaf margins. Leaf margins. The first of which is serrate. 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 Much like a serrated steak knife, we see these teeth that cut back in and out along the margin of the leaf. In and out, in and out, in and out along the margin of the leaf. And this is what we call serrate. Now we have double serrate, meaning we have a large tooth followed by several finer, smaller teeth within the same cluster. That is what we call doubly serrate, doubly serrate, doubly serrate. Next we have dentate. Now these form much larger teeth that, rather than having a curved angle, are much broader and triangular, pointing outward directly from where the stem and the vein comes. Dentate, almost like teeth. And then we have crenate. Crenate. This is similar to dentate, except rather than having an acute triangular point, it is more of a obtuse circular point or circular edge. So we can see it's more bubbly and cloud-like. When this is extended and the teeth are a lot larger, we call this undulate. We call it undulate. If there's start to see the forms of what we call sinuses, so these large indentations rather than the gaps between teeth, then we call it sinuate. Sinuate. And when these sinuses get extremely large, we call it lobed. So this is not a tooth because of this deep sinus here. We instead call this a lobed leaf. This is very common on oak species. Next, we're going to talk about twigs and shoots. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video for tonight. Let me know if you'd like to see the other part of this, as this is a new channel and I'm still testing the waters to see if there's interest in this type of content. So if you'd like to see a part 2, learning about twigs and shoots in winter tree identification, please leave a like and comment on this video, and consider subscribing for more future videos on nature-related content. Thank you very much.